Some wounds never heal, they just learn to live in the cold. For 10 years, Roan Maddox has survived alone in Montana's mountains, burying his heart as deep as the snow that surrounds his cabin. At 45, this weathered mountain man has built a simple life. Hunt, trap, survive, trust no one, need nothing. His world is silence and solitude, exactly how he wants it. But when a desperate young woman collapses near his trapline, everything changes. Isobel Reyes is running from a life she never chose. Half frozen and broken, she becomes the first person Roan has spoken to in months. As he nurses her back to health through the brutal winter, something awakens in both of them, something he thought was dead. After weeks of shared warmth and growing connection, Roan speaks words that will change everything. "I haven't touched a woman in 10 years now. You'll give me the sons I need." It's not a request. It's a claim born from a man who's forgotten how to ask for what he wants. But will a woman who's spent her life running from controlling men find the courage to stay with one who's forgotten how to love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat like a fortress against the Montana winter, its thick log walls chinked tight against winds that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs. Roan Maddox had built it with his own hands 15 years ago, back when he still believed in permanence, when he thought he'd found his place in the world. Now it served a different purpose, a shelter for a man who'd learned that the only person you could count on was yourself. The structure stood solid and square, in a clearing he'd carved from dense timber, positioned to catch the southern sun and backed against a granite outcrop that blocked the worst of the northern gales. Every beam, every board, every carefully fitted stone in the foundation told the story of a man who understood that survival meant attention to detail. The roof shed snow cleanly, the windows were positioned to provide clear sightlines in all directions, and the door was thick enough to stop a charging bear. Inside, the single room was Spartanly functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by countless fires that had kept him alive through winters that would have killed lesser men. A rough-hewn table sat beneath the south-facing window, scarred by years of cleaning game and sharpening tools. His bed occupied the far corner, a simple frame supporting a mattress stuffed with cedar shavings and covered in heavy wool blankets that smelled of wood smoke and solitude. The walls held the tools of his trade steel traps hanging from wooden pegs, his rifle resting in a rack he'd fashioned from elk antlers, skinning knives arranged with military precision on a leather roll. Shelves lined the walls, holding mason jars filled with preserved meat, dried vegetables, and herbs he'd learned to gather during his first desperate winter alone. Everything had its place, everything served a purpose, and everything could be maintained by one man who asked nothing from the world beyond these walls. Roan himself moved through this space with the quiet efficiency of a predator. At 45, he was still lean and strong, his body hardened by years of splitting wood, hauling water, and hiking traplines that stretched for miles through terrain that would challenge men half his age. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and deep lines bracketed his eyes marks left by squinting against snow glare and scanning distant ridgelines for sign of game or danger. His hands told their own story, scarred by countless small cuts and burns, calloused thick from axe handles and rope. They were hands that had learned to create what he needed and destroy what threatened him. The left bore a thin white line across the palm, where a skinning knife had slipped during his second winter alone, nearly costing him his life to infection. He'd learned to be more careful after that, because out here, carelessness was just another word for dying. The silence of his world was complete in a way that city folks could never understand. Not empty silence, but the full, rich quiet of a living wilderness. The creak of timber settling in the cold, the whisper of wind through pine boughs heavy with snow, the distant call of a hawk circling above tree line. These sounds had become his companions, more reliable than any human voice he'd known. His days followed patterns worn smooth by repetition. Rise before dawn, stoke the fire, brew coffee strong enough to wake the dead, check the weather, study the sky for signs of incoming storms, strap on snowshoes and work the traplines, reading the snow like other men read newspapers' every track, every disturbance telling him what had passed through his domain while he slept. The traplines themselves were a masterwork of patience and understanding. 47 sets positioned along game trails and creek bottoms, each one placed with the accumulated knowledge of a decade's observation. Marten sets tucked beneath the low-hanging branches of ancient spruces. Lynx snares positioned where the big cats like to travel along ridgelines. Beaver traps anchored in the dark water of ponds that wouldn't freeze until January turned truly bitter. It was honest work, clean work, work that connected him to the land in ways his previous life never had. The pelts he took would eventually make their way to markets in Missoula or Billings, traded for the few supplies he couldn't produce: his coffee, ammunition, salt, steel for trap repairs. But the money meant little to him now. The trapping was about something deeper, something that had to do with understanding his place in the natural order, with earning his keep through skill and sweat rather than politics or charm. The memories of his other life lived in a locked room in his mind, visited only in dreams that left him hollow and aching. Sarah's laugh, bright as summer morning. Little Daniel's chubby fingers wrapped around his thumb. The army uniform hanging in a closet in a house he'd never see again. The medals and commendations that meant nothing after the bureaucrats decided his protests about corruption were more dangerous than the corruption itself. The divorce papers that arrived while he was deployed, Sarah's lawyer explaining that she couldn't wait anymore, couldn't live with the uncertainty and anger that had become his closest companions. By the time he'd mustered out, there was nothing left to go back to. Sarah had remarried, taken Daniel to California, where her new husband promised stability and presence, things Roan had never learned to provide. His protests about the defense contracts that were killing good soldiers for private profit had earned him enemies in high places, men who made it clear that his continued presence in polite society would be unwelcome. So he'd come here, to this place where his skills mattered more than his politics, where a man could disappear into the wilderness and make a life based on what he could do with his own two hands. The first winter had nearly killed him. The second had taught him lessons that kept him alive. By the third, he'd stopped counting the days until spring and started accepting that this solitude might be permanent. The loneliness had been worst during the early years, gnawing at him like physical hunger. He'd catch himself talking to the animals he trapped, setting places for conversations with ghosts, starting letters he'd never send to people who'd moved on without him. But time had a way of wearing down even the sharpest edges of grief, and gradually the ache had settled into something more manageable, a constant, low-level awareness of absence, rather than the raw wound it had been. Now, at 45, he'd achieved something like peace with his chosen exile. His body was still strong, his mind sharp, his skills honed to a fine edge by years of depending on nothing but his own competence. He'd built a life that owed nothing to anyone, demanded nothing from a world that had taken everything he'd cared about, and asked only to be left alone with his routines and his silence, which made the woman's appearance all the more jarring. He'd been checking the line along Willow Creek, working his way upstream toward the beaver ponds, when he'd spotted the dark shape against the snow. At first he'd thought it was a downed animal, a deer maybe, or an elk calf that had wandered away from the herd and succumbed to cold. But as he'd approached, something about the outline had struck him as wrong, too angular, too deliberately positioned. She lay curled on her side in the hollow between two fallen logs, her dark hair stark against the white snow that had begun to accumulate on her still form. Her clothes were wrong for the country-thin fabric that belonged in parlors and drawing rooms, not in wilderness where the cold could kill you in minutes. Her lips were blue, her breathing so shallow he'd had to place his ear near her mouth to confirm she was still alive. For a long moment, he'd simply stared down at her, his mind struggling to process this impossibility. Women didn't appear in his world. People didn't appear in his world. In 10 years, he'd seen perhaps a dozen other human beings, mostly trappers working distant lines, or the occasional hunter who'd wandered farther from civilization than was wise. But never a woman, and certainly never one dressed like she was headed to Sunday service instead of fighting for survival in the Montana backcountry. His first instinct had been to back away, to let nature take its course and preserve the boundaries he'd worked so hard to establish. She was someone else's problem, someone else's responsibility. He owed nothing to strangers, especially strangers foolish enough to venture into wilderness unprepared for its realities. But even as these thoughts formed, his hands were already moving, checking for obvious injuries, assessing her condition with the automatic competence of a man who'd seen too many people die from exposure. She was hypothermic but not frostbitten, exhausted but not broken. Whatever had brought her here, she'd managed to survive long enough to stumble within range of help. And despite everything he'd told himself about independence and isolation, despite 10 years of carefully constructed solitude, Roan Maddox found himself unable to walk away from another human being in need. He'd lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she felt in his arms, and begun the long trek back to his cabin. With each step, he'd told himself he was making a mistake, that this moment of weakness would cost him the peace he'd worked so hard to achieve. But her head had rolled against his shoulder with each stride, and something deep in his chest, something he'd thought was dead and buried, had stirred to life like a banked fire suddenly given air. By the time he'd reached his door, Roan Maddox knew that his 10 years of solitude were over, whether he wanted them to be or not. The fever came in waves, turning the woman's skin hot as a forge one moment and cold as creek water the next. Roan had stripped her out of the sodden, inappropriate clothing and wrapped her in his heaviest wool blankets, positioning her on the bed closest to the fire where the heat could work its way back into her bones. For 3 days, she'd drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering words in both English and Spanish that painted a picture of desperation and flight. "Please, no," she whispered during one delirious episode, her hands clutching at the blankets. "I won't marry him. I won't be his property." Her voice carried an educated accent, refined but tinged with something that might have been Texas or New Mexico. "Edgar, please, there has to be another way." Roan found himself studying her face as she slept fitfully. She was younger than he'd first thought, early 20s, maybe with fine bones and skin that suggested she'd lived most of her life indoors. Her hands were soft, except for recent calluses and cuts that spoke of hard travel and unfamiliar work. Whatever had driven her into the wilderness, it hadn't been a casual decision. During her lucid moments, she was polite but guarded, accepting the broth he spooned between her lips and the willow bark tea he brewed to break her fever. She asked no questions about where she was or who he was, as if those details mattered less than the simple fact that she was alive and warm, and for the moment, safe. It was on the 4th morning that she finally spoke with full awareness, her dark eyes tracking his movements as he built up the fire for the day. "You saved my life," she said simply, her voice hoarse from fever and disuse. Roan glanced over his shoulder, surprised by the steadiness in her tone. "You were half frozen, didn't have much choice in the matter." "There's always a choice." She struggled to sit up, the blankets pooling around her waist. "Most men would have kept walking." "Most men don't live out here." He kept his back turned, giving her space to gather herself. "You feel strong enough for real food?" "I think so, and I should tell you my name is Isobel Reyes." Roan Maddox. He moved to the shelves where he kept his preserved stores. "And you should tell me what brought you to my trapline wearing party clothes in the middle of a Montana winter." The silence stretched long enough that he turned to look at her. Isobel was staring into the fire, her fingers worrying at something around her neck, a gold chain, with what looked like a ring hanging from it. "I was supposed to be married," she said finally. 3 days ago, actually, to a man named Edgar Whitmore. "Supposed to be, but you're here instead." I ran. The words came out flat, matter of fact. The night before the ceremony, I climbed out my bedroom window and ran. Roan set down the jar of preserved venison he'd been reaching for. "That's a long way to run. Where'd you start from?" "Billings. My father has had business interests there. Mining contracts mostly. Edgar was his partner, and when Papa died last year, Edgar decided the partnership should include me as well. Decided, not asked. Isobel's laugh held no humor. Edgar doesn't ask for things, he takes them. The business, the house, mate was all just part of the same transaction to him. Roan resumed his preparations, but his movements had taken on a deliberate quality that suggested controlled anger. So you ran instead of marrying him. I stole a horse and rode until it foundered. Then I walked. I kept to game trails and creek beds, trying to stay ahead of anyone who might be following. She pulled the chain from beneath the blankets, revealing a heavy gold ring set with a diamond that would have cost more than most men earned in a year. I should have thrown this away miles ago, but somehow I couldn't. It belonged to my mother. The ring Edgar gave you? No. Mama's wedding ring. She died when I was 12, and Papa kept it in his desk drawer. Edgar had it reset with a bigger stone, said it would be more appropriate for his wife. Her voice had gone quiet, almost dreamy. I kept thinking about her wearing this simple little band, being happy with Papa, choosing her own life, and I realized I'd never chosen anything important for myself, not once. Roan watched her turn the ring over in her fingers, saw the moment when her face hardened with resolution. Before he could speak, she stood and walked to the fireplace, her movements swift and decisive despite her recent illness. "But I'm choosing now," she said, and threw the ring into the flames. The gold caught the firelight for a moment, gleaming like a star before disappearing into the coals. The diamond, somewhere in that molten heart, would survive the fire, but the setting Edgar's setting was gone forever. Roan felt something shift in his chest as he watched her stand there in his wool blankets, her chin raised and her dark eyes reflecting the flames. This wasn't the helpless society woman he'd rescued from the snow. This was someone who'd found her backbone in the space between one breath and the next. "That was an expensive gesture," he said quietly. "It was a necessary one." She turned to face him, and he saw that her hands were steady now, her voice clear. "I can't go back to who I was before. That woman would have married Edgar Whitmore and spent the rest of her life apologizing for taking up space in the world. And who are you now? I don't know yet, but I know I'm not his." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither of them was quite ready to examine. Roan found himself looking at her properly for the first Timano as a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed, but as a woman who'd burned her bridges and was standing in the ashes, ready to build something new. She was beautiful, he realized with a start, that was almost physical. Not the painted, corseted beauty of town women, but something more fundamental. The fever had left her cheeks hollow and her skin pale, but her eyes held a light that hadn't been there during her delirium, the brightness of someone who'd discovered their own strength. "You can't stay here," he said, the words coming out more roughly than he'd intended. "I know. When the snow melts, I'll move on. Find work somewhere, maybe in California or Oregon, somewhere Edgar won't think to look. That's months away. The passes won't be clear until May, maybe June." Isobel nodded, apparently unsurprised by this information. "Then I suppose we'll have to make the best of it, both of us." The simple acceptance in her voice caught him off guard. She wasn't pleading or bargaining or trying to charm her way into his hospitality. She was stating a fact, acknowledging the reality they both faced, and trusting him to be decent enough to honor the unspoken agreement that civilized people didn't abandon each other to die in the wilderness. "I won't be a burden," she continued. "I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I'm not afraid of work." "It's not about work." He moved closer to the fire, close enough to smell the wood smoke in her hair and see the fine grain of her skin in the firelight. "I chose this life because I wanted to be alone, because I needed to be alone. And I chose to run because I needed to be free. Sometimes what we need and what we get aren't the same thing." The truth of that statement settled between them like a third presence in the room. Roan had spent 10 years building a life around the certainty that solitude was safety, that needing nothing from anyone was the only protection against loss. But now this woman, this girl, really, though something in her eyes suggested she'd aged years in the past few days, was standing in his cabin wearing his blankets. and he found himself wondering if the walls he'd built to keep the world out might also be keeping something essential from getting in. "There are rules if you're staying," he said finally. "Such as, you do what I tell you to do when I tell you to do it. Out here, hesitation kills people. Understanding the country, reading the weather, knowing when to move and when to wait, that takes years to learn, and we don't have years." "Agreed. You don't wander off alone. You don't touch my traps or my weapons without permission. You don't do anything that might draw attention from the wrong kind of people. You think Edgar will send men after me?" "I think men like Edgar don't like losing things they consider theirs, and I think winter makes people desperate enough to try things they wouldn't attempt in better weather." Isobel considered this, her fingers absently touching the place where the chain had rested against her throat. "What happens if they find us?" "They won't." The certainty in his voice was absolute, backed by decades of military training and 10 years of living in country that could hide a man from armies if he knew what he was doing. "But if they try, they'll learn why smart people don't hunt wolves in their own den." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely, and for a moment she glimpsed the soldier he'd been, the man who'd learned to kill efficiently and without regret, whose hands knew violence as intimately as they knew the weight of an axe or the balance of a skinning knife. "You've done this before," she said. "Hidden people, I mean." "I've hidden myself. That's enough." She nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer. "Then I'll trust you to keep us both safe. And I'll trust you not to make that job harder than it has to be." They shook hands on it, her small fingers disappearing into his calloused palm. The contact was brief, businesslike, but Roan found himself aware of the warmth of her skin, the delicate bones beneath the surface, the way she met his grip with steady pressure, instead of the limp handshake he'd expected from a woman raised in drawing rooms. When she released his hand and stepped back, he felt the absence like a physical thing. It had been so long since he'd touched another human being that he'd forgotten the simple comfort of skin against skin, the fundamental connection that reminded you that you weren't the only living thing in a world of stone and ice and silence. "I should get you some proper clothes," he said, turning away before she could read whatever expression had crossed his face. "What you were wearing won't last a week up here." "What happened to my dress?" "Burned it. Frozen fabric will give you frostbite when it thaws." "Oh." She looked down at herself, apparently just realizing she was wearing nothing but his blankets. A faint blush colored her cheeks, but she didn't flutter or apologize. "I suppose modesty is a luxury we can't afford right now. I've got some spare clothes that might fit. Used to belong to—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "To someone else who stayed here." "To my wife." The admission came out harder than he'd intended. "She was about your size." Isobel studied his face, reading the pain he tried to keep hidden. "She's gone?" 10 years now." He moved to a chest in the corner, lifting the lid to reveal carefully folded garments that still held the faint scent of lavender sachets. "Sarah." Her name was Sarah. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. Just wear the clothes. They're meant to be worn." As he lifted out a heavy wool dress and warm undergarments, Roan found himself wondering what Sarah would have thought of this situation. She'd always been practical about necessities, understanding that survival sometimes required unconventional arrangements. But she'd also been protective of what was hers, and these clothes, these last tangible reminders of their life together, had been hers in a way that transcended mere ownership. "You don't have to do this," Isobel said quietly. "I know it can't be easy, sharing her things with a stranger. You're not exactly a stranger anymore. And she'd have skinned me alive if I let a woman freeze to death because I was too sentimental to share a dress." He handed her the bundle of clothes, careful not to let their fingers touch again. "Get dressed. We need to talk about what comes next." As Isobel moved behind the hanging blanket he'd rigged for privacy, Roan found himself staring into the fire where her wedding ring had disappeared. Somewhere in those coals was the last physical link to her old life, reduced to elemental gold and carbon. In a way, he understood the gesture. He'd burned his own bridges when he'd come to the mountains, though his had been bridges of career and reputation rather than gold and diamonds. But understanding and approving were different things. The practical part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through war and wilderness, was already calculating the complications her presence would create. Food stores that would have to stretch further, routines disrupted, the constant awareness of another person in his carefully ordered world. And underneath those practical concerns was something else, something that had stirred to life when she'd thrown her ring into the fire and declared herself free. It was a feeling he'd thought was buried as deep as his military medals and his marriage certificate, the recognition of kindred spirit. Someone else who'd been broken by the world's expectations and had chosen to rebuild themselves on their own terms. As he listened to the soft sounds of her dressing behind the blanket, Roan Maddox realized that his 10 years of solitude hadn't prepared him for this moment. He'd learned to live without companionship, without conversation, without the 1,000 small intimacies that made life bearable, but he'd never learned to live with them again. And the prospect of spending the winter in close quarters with a woman who'd just discovered her own strength was both thrilling and terrifying in ways he wasn't ready to examine. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending snow spiraling past the windows. Winter was tightening its grip on the mountains, sealing them in together until spring. Whatever happened between now and then, there would be no escape for either of them, from the weather, from each other, or from the consequences of the choices they'd both made in the space of a few short days. The rhythm of shared survival established itself gradually over the following weeks, measured in small accommodations and careful boundaries. Isobel proved herself more adaptable than Roan had expected, watching his routines with intelligent attention and inserting herself into the work without fanfare or complaint. She learned to bank the fire properly for overnight burning, to prepare simple meals from his stores of preserved meat and root vegetables, to mend the small tears that mountain living inflicted on clothing and equipment. Sarah's clothes fit her well enough, the wool dress hanging loose in places but providing the warmth and durability she needed. She'd taken to braiding her long dark hair back in a practical style that kept it out of her face while she worked, and the soft refinement of her features had begun to show the influence of mountain air and simple food. The hollow look of fever and exhaustion was filling out, replaced by a quiet competence that reminded Roan uncomfortably of his late wife. Their conversations during those early weeks were careful, polite, and surface level. She asked about the country, the weather patterns, the animals they might encounter. He answered with the patience of a man who understood that ignorance in the wilderness could be fatal, teaching her to read the sky for storm signs and recognize the tracks that crossed their small clearing each night. "Elk," he said one morning, crouching beside the deep impressions left in fresh snow near the woodpile. "Bull, by the size. Probably came through just before dawn, heading down to the creek." Isobel knelt beside him, studying the tracks with the focused attention she brought to all his lessons. "How can you tell it was a bull?" "Size of the hooves, length of the stride. Cows step lighter, don't press as deep. And see here," he pointed to a spot where the snow had been disturbed by something other than hooves. "Antler scrape. Bulls drag their racks when they're tired." She traced the mark with her finger, careful not to disturb the sign. "Could we hunt it?" "Could, but we don't need to yet. Got enough meat to last through February, maybe March if we're careful. Better to let him live until necessity says otherwise." That's different from how most men think about hunting. Most men hunt for sport. I hunt to eat. It was during one of these teaching moments that Roan first noticed how naturally she moved in his space, how she'd begun to anticipate his needs without being asked. She had coffee ready when he returned from checking the morning traplines. She kept the fire fed without being reminded. She'd taken over the daily task of melting snow for washing and drinking water, a tedious job that required constant attention to keep the buckets from freezing solid. More importantly, she did these things quietly, without the chatter or need for approval that he'd expected from someone accustomed to society life. She seemed to understand that the cabin's peace was fragile, that the silence wasn't empty but full of its own meaning. When she did speak, it was usually to ask practical questions or share observations about their small world. "The wind sounds different when it comes from the north," she said one evening as they sat by the fire after supper. Sharper, more urgent. North wind brings the hard cold, sometimes blizzards. You can hear it in the way it moves through the trees. And the south wind? Chinook, warm wind that can melt snow in hours and turn the world to mud, just as dangerous in its own way. She nodded, filing the information away with the focused attention of someone who understood that her life might depend on such details. It was one of the things he was beginning to respect about Hearth, the way she listened with her whole mind, not just waiting for her turn to talk. The physical aspects of their shared existence had required their own adjustments. The cabin's single room meant privacy was a matter of courtesy rather than walls. They'd established routines around dressing and bathing, times when one would venture outside to check snares or gather firewood while the other attended to personal needs. It was awkward at first, the hyper-awareness of another person's presence in what had been his solitary domain. But gradually, it began to feel less like an intrusion and more like a natural accommodation to changed circumstances. The most significant change came when Roan decided she needed to learn to defend herself. Out here, being helpless is a luxury you can't afford, he said one morning after breakfast, lifting his hunting knife from its place on the wall. Man or animal, there might come a time when you're on your own and fighting for your life. The knife was a serious piece of workite, inches of carbon steel, with a bone handle worn smooth by years of use. It had gutted deer, skinned beaver, carved wood, and served as eating utensil, tool, and weapon, as circumstances required. In Roan's hands, it was an extension of his will, as familiar as his own fingers. "I've never held a knife like that," Isobel admitted, eyeing the blade with equal parts fascination and nervousness. "Then it's time you learned." He flipped the knife, catching it by the blade and offering her the handle. "Careful, it's sharp enough to cut leather." She took it gingerly, surprised by the weight and balance. "It's heavier than I expected." Good steel has to have weight behind it. Now, first thing, never hold a knife like you're afraid of it. Fear makes you hesitant, and hesitation gets you killed. He guided her hands to the proper grip, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers to position her thumb and show her how the handle should rest in her palm. The contact was purely instructional, but Roan found himself aware of the warmth of her skin, the slenderness of her wrists, the way she held herself very still as he adjusted her stance. "Like this?" she asked, and he could hear the concentration in her voice. "Better. Now, the knife is a close-quarters weapon. You use it when something gets past your other defenses. The trick is to keep it simple thrust, slash, cut. Don't try to be fancy." He stepped behind her, guiding her through the basic motions. Forward thrust, blade up, slash across, follow through. Back cut, return to guard position. She was a quick study, her movements becoming more confident as she repeated the sequence. Her body had a natural grace that translated well to the controlled violence of knife work, and after an hour of practice, she was moving the blade with something approaching competence. "Better," he said finally, taking the knife back and sliding it into its sheath. "But knowing the motions isn't the same as being able to use it when your life depends on it. How do you learn that?" "Hope you never have to." He met her eyes, saw the seriousness there, the understanding that this wasn't theoretical knowledge. "But if the time comes, remember what I told you. Don't hesitate, don't think, just act." She nodded, and he saw that she was imagining scenarios, preparing herself mentally for possibilities she hoped would never materialize. It was a mature response, the reaction of someone who'd learned that the world could turn dangerous without warning. That evening, as they sat by the fire after their simple supper, Isobel broke their comfortable silence with a question that caught him off guard. "Do you ever regret it? Living alone, I mean." Roan considered the question while he cleaned his rifle, a nightly ritual that kept the weapon in perfect working order. "Regret's a useless emotion. You make choices based on what you know at the time, then live with the consequences." "That's not really an answer. It's the only answer I've got." He ran the cleaning rod through the barrel, checking for any trace of fouling. "Why? You having second thoughts about running away?" "No, but I'm wondering if I'm making the same mistake Edgar did, assuming I know what's best for someone else." This time he did look up from his work, studying her face in the firelight. "How do you figure? You chose this life because you wanted to be alone. Then I showed up and disrupted everything. Maybe I should have kept walking, found another way to survive the winter. Maybe, but you didn't, and I didn't let you. So now we're both living with choices we made in the moment, without knowing how they'd turn out. Do you mind? Having me here, I mean." The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither of them was quite ready to examine. Roan found himself thinking about the small changes her presence had brought to his routines, the sound of another person moving through his space, the smell of her hair when she leaned close to the fire, the way she hummed softly while she worked. "Ask me again in spring," he said finally, "when we're both free to choose what comes next." It was an honest answer, perhaps more honest than either of them was comfortable with, because the truth was that Roan was beginning to realize he didn't mind her presence as much as he'd expected. The disruption to his solitude was real, but so was the unexpected comfort of sharing his space with someone who understood the value of silence, who worked without complaint, who asked intelligent questions and listened to the answers. More troubling was the growing awareness of her as a woman, rather than simply a person in need of help. It had been 10 years since he'd shared close quarters with someone of the opposite sex. 10 years since he'd been conscious of feminine grace in the way someone moved, or the sound of quiet breathing from the other side of a darkened room. He'd thought those responses were dead in him, killed by grief and isolation, and the deliberate numbing that came with choosing solitude over connection. But as he watched Isobel bank the fire for the night, her movements efficient and precise, he felt something stir that had nothing to do with simple companionship. It was attraction, raw and uncomplicated, the response of a man who'd been alone too long to a woman who'd proven herself worthy of respect. The recognition was both welcome and terrifying. Welcome because it meant he was still capable of feeling something beyond the carefully controlled emotions that had sustained him through his exile. Terrifying because attraction led to attachment, and attachment led to vulnerability, and vulnerability was the one thing his carefully constructed life couldn't accommodate. As they settled into their respective sleeping areas, she on the bed, he on a pallet by the fire that he'd insisted was more comfortable than it looked, Roan found himself listening to the soft sounds of her settling in for the night, the rustle of blankets, the small sigh as she found a comfortable position, the gradual deepening of her breathing as sleep took hold. It had been so long since he'd fallen asleep to the sound of another person's breathing that he'd forgotten how comforting it could be. The simple knowledge that he wasn't alone in the darkness, that another human heart was beating in rhythm with his own, that if something went wrong in the night, there would be someone to share the burden of survival. But comfort and danger were often the same thing, and as Roan finally drifted towards sleep, he found himself wondering if saving Isobel Reyes might turn out to be the act that finally broke down the walls he'd spent 10 years building around his heart. It was while organizing supplies in the cabin's small root cellar that Isobel made the discovery that changed everything between them. She'd been taking inventory of the preserved vegetables, checking for signs of spoilage in the turnips and carrots Roan had stored in sand-filled crates, when her hand brushed against something unexpected tucked behind the potato bin. The carved wooden horse was no bigger than her palm, its surface worn smooth by countless small fingers. Every detail had been lovingly crafted, the flowing mane, the alert ears, the powerful hindquarters caught in mid-gallop. It was the work of someone who understood both wood and the subject he was carving, someone who'd put hours of patient effort into creating something perfect for a child's hands. She climbed back up into the main cabin, holding the little horse carefully, her heart already heavy with understanding. Roan was at the table, working on trap repairs, but he looked up when she approached with the wooden toy cradled in her palms. The expression that crossed his face was like watching a man take a physical blow, a moment of raw pain before the careful mask slid back into place. He set down his tools and reached for the horse, his movements gentle despite the tremor in his hands. "Where did you find this?" "Behind the potatoes. I'm sorry, I wasn't snooping. I was just checking the stores like you asked." Roan turned the little horse over in his fingers, and Isobel saw decades of suppressed grief in the careful way he touched each carved detail. "I made this for my son, Daniel. He'd be 15 now, if—" The words caught in his throat. "He died?" "No, worse in some ways. He's alive and well and living in California with his mother and stepfather. Calls another man daddy and probably doesn't remember the father who carved him toys and taught him to fish and told him bedtime stories about brave horses that could outrun the wind." Isobel settled into the chair across from him, giving him space to continue or not as he chose. The pain in his voice was fresh despite the years that had passed, and she recognized the particular ache of love that had nowhere to go. "Sarah took him when she remarried. Said it would be better for everyone if we made a clean break, let him grow up in a stable home with parents who could give him what he needed." Roan's thumb traced the horse's carved mane. "She was probably right. I wasn't much of a father in those days. Too angry, too bitter about what the army had cost me, too focused on fighting battles that were already lost. But you loved him. More than my own life still do." He looked up at her, and she saw the echo of that younger man, the one who'd carved toys and dreamed of teaching his son to be a good man. "I used to imagine him growing up here with me, teaching him to read tracks, to respect the land, to be self-sufficient and strong. Stupid dreams, maybe, but they kept me company during the hard years. Not stupid, human." Roan set the horse on the table between them, where it seemed to catch and hold the firelight. "I've wondered sometimes what kind of man he's becoming, whether he's happy, whether he ever thinks about his old dad who disappeared into the mountains. Children don't forget their first love that easily. He remembers you. Maybe, or maybe Sarah was right, and he's better off without the complication of a father who couldn't find his place in civilized society." Isobel reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the first deliberate physical contact between them since their handshake weeks ago. His skin was warm and calloused, marked by small scars that told the story of his years in the wilderness. "You're not the same man who lost them," she said quietly. "Grief changes us, but so does time. So does choosing to survive when survival would be easier to give up. What makes you think I chose to survive? Maybe I just didn't have the courage to quit. Because I recognize the choice. I've made it myself." She squeezed his hand gently before releasing it. "When my father died and Edgar started making plans for my future, I could have accepted it, gone along with what everyone expected, married him, and spent my life being grateful for his protection. That would have been easier than running. But you ran anyway. Because I realized that surviving isn't just about staying alive. It's about staying yourself, keeping the parts of you that matter most intact, no matter what the world tries to take away." Roan picked up the wooden horse again, holding it up to catch the light. "This is all I have left of the man I used to be, the father I used to be." "No, it isn't." Isobel's voice was firm, cutting through his self-pity with gentle authority. "That man is still in there. I've seen him in the way you teach me things, the patience you show when I make mistakes, the way you worry about my safety without making me feel helpless. That's different. You're not. I'm not your child, no, but you're still protecting someone, still passing on what you know, still caring about whether another person grows stronger or weaker under your influence. That's what fathers do, isn't it?" The truth of her words settled between them like a third presence in the room. Roan found himself looking at her with new eyes, seeing not just the woman he'd rescued from the snow, but someone who understood loss and reconstruction, who recognized the difference between surviving and living. "Tell me about him," she said. "What was he like?" And so he did. For the first time in 10 years, Roan Maddox talked about his son, about Daniel's laugh, bright as summer morning, about the way he'd follow his father around the yard, asking endless questions about everything from bugs to airplanes, about his gentleness with animals and his fascination with stories of knights and dragons and heroes who always did the right thing, no matter the cost. He had this way of seeing the good in everything, Roan said, his voice growing softer as the memories took hold. "Sarah used to say he got that from me, back when I still believed the world was more good than bad. Even when things got rough between us, when I was drinking too much and staying angry too long, Daniel would still climb into my lap and tell me about his day like I was the most important person in his world. He sounds wonderful. He is, Roan corrected himself, a small smile touching his lips. I hope he still is. What would you tell him if you could see him now? Today, I mean. The question caught him off guard, and he was quiet for a long moment, considering. I'd tell him I'm sorry. For being so angry when he was small, for letting my bitterness poison the time we had together. I'd tell him I think about him every day, and that everything I learned about being a man's good parts anyway came from trying to be the kind of father he deserved. And what would you want him to know about you now? That I figured out how to find peace, eventually. That the mountains taught me things I couldn't learn anywhere else about patience, about accepting what you can't change, about finding strength in solitude when the world gets too heavy to bear with company. Isobel nodded, understanding something in his words that went deeper than their surface meaning. He'd be proud of you. The man who carved this horse, who built this cabin with his own hands, who saved a stranger's life because it was the right thing to do, that's a man worth being proud of. You think so? I know so, because I'm starting to understand what it means to choose who you become instead of letting circumstances choose for you. And you've chosen to become someone worth knowing. The admission hung in the air between them, more intimate than anything they'd shared so far. It was an acknowledgement of attraction, yes, but also of respect, the recognition that whatever was growing between them was built on more than proximity and convenience. Roan felt something loosening in his chest, a knot of old pain that had been wound tight for so long he'd forgotten it was there. For the first time in 10 years, he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to care about someone again, to let another person matter enough to change the careful patterns of his existence. I used to think about having more children, he said quietly, back when I still believed I'd have the chance. Sons who could learn from my mistakes, maybe daughters who'd keep me honest about what really matters in life. And now I'm 45 years old and living alone in the mountains. Not exactly what most women would consider good father material. Isobel was quiet for a moment, studying his face in the firelight. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful, considering. Maybe the question isn't whether you'd be a good father to some imaginary child. Maybe it's whether the right woman would want to build that kind of life with the man you've become. The words struck him like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were kinder than he'd dared hope for in years. The possibility they suggested was both terrifying and wonderful, a future he'd taught himself not to want because wanting it had hurt too much when it was taken away. And what kind of life would that be, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, but I imagine it would be honest, built on respect instead of convenience, on choice instead of obligation. Children who grew up, understanding that strength comes from facing hard things instead of running from them. Children who knew their parents chose each other every day, not just on their wedding day. Yes, she met his eyes, and he saw his own longing reflected there. Children who understood that love isn't just a feeling, it's a commitment to someone else's happiness, even when that commitment costs you something. They sat in silence for a long moment, the carved horse between them, like a bridge between the past he'd lost and the future he was afraid to want. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and reminding them both that they were sealed in together until spring, with months ahead to discover what might grow between them. I should put this away, Roan said finally, reaching for the wooden horse. Or you could leave it out, where you can see it. Why would I do that? Because forgetting isn't the same as healing, and maybe it's time to stop punishing yourself for caring about people who couldn't stay. She stood and moved to the fire, adding another log with the practiced efficiency she'd developed over their weeks together. The flames caught and flared, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls and illuminating the small space that had become their shared world. Isobel, he said, and she turned to look at him. Thank you for listening, for understanding. Thank you for trusting me with it. As she prepared for bed, Moving through the routines they'd established, Roan found himself watching her with new awareness. Not just as the woman he'd rescued, or the unexpected companion who'd disrupted his solitude, but as someone who might, if they were both brave enough, become something more. The wooden horse sat on the table where she'd suggested, catching the firelight and casting its own small shadow. It was a reminder of loss, yes, but also of love, proof that he'd once cared enough about another person to spend hours creating something perfect for their small hands. As he settled onto his pallet by the fire, listening to Isobel's quiet breathing from across the room, Roan Maddox allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to care that much again. To have someone worth protecting, worth providing for, worth building a future with in this harsh and beautiful country he'd made his home. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, for the first time in 10 years, it filled him with something dangerously close to hope. The blizzard struck 3 days before Christmas, with the sudden ferocity that characterized Montana winters at their worst. Roan had been watching the sky for signs, reading the subtle changes in wind direction and the way the wildlife moved with increasing urgency through the forest. When the temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours and the wind shifted to blow straight down from Canada, he knew they were in for something serious. "Storm's coming," he told Isobel, as he secured the shutters over the storm window's thick wooden barriers designed to protect the glass from driving snow and debris. Big one, by the feel of it. Could last 3 days, maybe more. She helped him drag additional firewood inside, stacking it near the hearth where it would stay dry and accessible. They filled every available container with water, knowing that once the storm hit in earnest, venturing outside even to the well would be impossible. "How bad?" she asked, noting the grim efficiency with which he moved through his preparations. "Bad enough. Temperature's going to drop below 0 and stay there. Wind will make it feel like 40 below. Snow will come down so thick you won't be able to see your hand in front of your face." He secured the last shutter and turned to survey their preparations. "We'll be fine as long as we stay inside and keep the fire going." The storm hit that evening with a roar that seemed to shake the cabin's foundation. Snow drove against the shuttered windows with the force of thrown sand, and the wind howled through the gaps in the logs with a sound like tortured souls. The temperature inside the cabin began to drop despite the roaring fire, and they found themselves huddled closer to the hearth as the hours passed. By the second day, their world had shrunk to the small circle of warmth around the fireplace. The storm window's thick barriers that normally provided an extra layer of insulation had become their lifeline, the only thing standing between them and the killing cold that pressed against the cabin from all sides. Ice began to form on the inside walls despite their best efforts, and their breath steamed in the frigid air. "Come here," Roan said during the worst of it, when the wind seemed to be trying to tear the roof off and the cold was seeping through every crack in their defenses. "We need to share body heat." There was nothing romantic about the necessity. It was simple survival, the recognition that hypothermia could kill them even inside their shelter if they weren't careful. But as Isobel moved closer to him, settling against his side beneath the heavy wool blankets he'd pulled from the bed, Roan found himself acutely aware of her warmth, her softness, the way she fit naturally against his larger frame. They sat pressed together for hours, feeding the fire and listening to the storm rage outside. Conversation was sporadic, partly because talking meant losing precious heat through their mouths, but mostly because the intimacy of their position made casual chat impossible. This was survival at its most basic, two people, sharing warmth and breath, and the fundamental comfort of not being alone in the face of nature's fury. During the long, cold hours, their barriers began to dissolve in ways that had nothing to do with physical proximity. Isobel told him about her childhood in Texas, about the mother she barely remembered, and the father who'd loved her, but never quite known what to do with a daughter in a world built for sons. Roan found himself sharing memories he'd kept locked away for years, stories about his own youth in Missouri, about learning to hunt and fish, from a grandfather who taught him that patience was the most important virtue a man could possess. "I used to think patience was just another word for giving up," Isobel murmured against his shoulder, waiting for other people to decide what my life should look like. It's not the same thing. Patience is activates, choosing to wait for the right moment instead of forcing things that aren't ready to happen. Like surviving this storm instead of trying to fight it. Exactly. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is endure. As the hours passed, the simple act of breathing together, of sharing warmth and space, and the quiet intimacy of whispered conversation began to feel like the most natural thing in the world. When Isobel's head dropped against his shoulder in exhaustion, Roan found himself stroking her hair without conscious thought, his fingers gentle as they worked through the tangles the dry air had created. "This feels dangerous," she said quietly, not moving away from his touch. "The storm? You know what I mean." He did know. The growing closeness between them, the way his heart rate picked up when she looked at him with those dark eyes, the increasing awareness of her as a woman rather than simply a companion in survival. It was dangerous because it meant caring, and caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was something neither of them could afford in their carefully constructed new lives. "Maybe dangerous isn't always bad," he said, surprising himself with the admission. "Maybe not. But it's always complicated. I've been thinking about that, about complications." His hand stilled in her hair, but he didn't pull away. Wondering if maybe the things that complicate our lives are also the things that make life worth living. She lifted her head to look at him, and in the firelight he could see the same confusion and longing he felt reflected in her expression. They were close enough that he could feel her breath on his face, close enough to count the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that 10 years ago, I decided the safest way to live was to not want anything I couldn't provide for myself. No needs that depended on other people. No dreams that could be taken away by circumstances beyond my control. And now I'm wondering if safe and alive are the same thing." The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with possibilities that both thrilled and terrified them. Outside, the storm continued its assault on their small sanctuary, but inside, something was shifting barriers carefully maintained, for weeks were beginning to crumble under the pressure of honesty and proximity. "Roan," she whispered, and he heard in her voice the same war between desire and self-preservation that was raging in his own heart. I know it's complicated. I know we're both running from different kinds of pain, and getting involved with each other could make everything worse. But sitting here with you, feeling you breathe, knowing that for the first time in 10 years, I'm not facing the darkness alone, it makes me think that maybe some complications are worth the risk." She was quiet for a long moment, and he could feel the tension in her body as she wrestled with her own desires and fears. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible above the howling wind. "I don't know how to do this. How to care about someone without losing myself in the process. Neither do I, but maybe that's something we could figure out together." The kiss, when it came, was inevitable as Sunrizia's natural conclusion to hours of growing closeness and careful honesty. It started tentative, questioning, both of them aware that this moment would change everything between them. But as their lips met and held, tentative became certain, questioning became answering, and the careful distance they'd maintained dissolved like snow in summer sun. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Isobel pressed her forehead against his and closed her eyes. "This changes things," she said. "Yes, it does. I'm still planning to leave in the spring. I still need to build a life that's mine, not something handed to me by someone else. I know. And you're still a man who chose solitude for good reasons, reasons that don't disappear just because we're attracted to each other. I know that too. So what do we do?" Roan considered the question while he studied her face in the firelight, the delicate bones of her cheeks, the determined set of her jaw, the vulnerability in her eyes that she was trying so hard to hide. "We take it one day at a time," he said finally. "We be honest with each other about what we want and what we're afraid of, and we remember that caring about someone doesn't mean owning them. And if I still want to leave when the snow melts, then I'll help you pack." The promise cost him something to make, but he meant it. Whatever was growing between them, it had to be built on choice rather than circumstance, on mutual desire rather than simple convenience. If Isobel chose to leave, it would break something in him that had just begun to heal, but it would be her choice to make, not his to prevent. And if I decide I want to stay, then we'll figure out what that looks like, together. As the storm continued to rage outside their small circle of warmth, they settled back into each other's arms with a new understanding between them. The storm windows that had protected them from the killing cold were like the barriers they'd both built around, their hearts necessary for survival, but also isolating. Now, in the face of something that threatened to overwhelm their defenses, they'd found the courage to let someone else inside. The blizzard would pass, as all storms eventually did. But what had grown between them during those long, cold hours would endure, fragile as new ice, but strong enough to build on if they had the courage to try. The days following the blizzard carried a different quality of intimacy, as if the storm had stripped away pretenses they hadn't even realized they were maintaining. Roan found himself hyper-aware of Isobel's presence in ways that had nothing to do with practical concerns, the way she hummed softly while preparing their simple meals, the graceful economy of her movements as she went about her daily tasks, the sound of her quiet laughter when he told stories about his early, fumbling attempts to master mountain living. She was sitting by the window on a bright morning, mending a tear in one of his shirts, when she made an observation that stopped him in his tracks. "Your compass is broken," she said, nodding toward the instrument that sat on the shelf above his workbench. Roan glanced at the compass, a reliable piece that had guided him through countless miles of wilderness over the years. "What makes you think that?" "The needle. It spins freely instead of pointing north." He lifted the compass down and examined it, surprised to find she was right. The needle that had once held steady as his own sense of direction now wandered aimlessly around the dial, unable to find true north or any other reliable bearing. "Damn," he muttered, shaking the instrument gently to see if that would restore its function. "Must have gotten damaged during the storm somehow." "Is that a problem?" "Could be. If I get turned around out there, especially in bad weather, this little piece of metal can be the difference between making it home and wandering in circles until I freeze to death." Isobel set down her mending and moved to stand beside him, studying the wayward needle. "So, what do you do without it?" "Learn to navigate by other means, stars if they're visible, landmarks when you can see them. The way water flows, the direction of prevailing winds." He set the compass on the table with more force than necessary. "Or stay close to home until I can get to town for a replacement." "That bothers you more than just the practical problem, doesn't it?" The question caught him off guard with its insight. "What do you mean?" "You've spent 10 years building a life based on self-sufficiency, depending on your own skills, your own judgment, your own ability to find your way through whatever challenges come up. And now this little tool that helped you do that is broken, and you can't fix it." He looked at her with something approaching wonder. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "See things so clearly. Understand what something means instead of just what it is. Maybe because I've spent most of my life feeling lost myself. I recognize the fear that comes with not knowing which direction to go." The simple honesty of her answer hit him harder than any elaborate explanation could have. For the first time since the storm, he found himself really looking at her not as the woman whose presence had disrupted his careful solitude, but as someone who understood loss and confusion and the sometimes desperate need to find solid ground in a world that seemed determined to keep shifting beneath your feet. "Tell me about being lost," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. What it felt like growing up in your father's house, what it was like when Edgar started making plans for your future, what made you finally decide to run." Isobel was quiet for a moment, her fingers absently tracing the compass's broken needle. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful, as if she were discovering the truth of her own experience as she put it into words. "I think I started getting lost the day my mother died. Before that, I had someone who saw me as myself, instead of as a problem to be solved, or an asset to be managed. Mama used to tell me stories about women who made their own choices, who carved out space in the world through intelligence and determination rather than beauty or compliance. And after she died, Papa tried, but he didn't know what to do with a daughter who asked questions and had opinions. It was easier for him to treat me like a delicate flower that needed protection from anything that might damage or complicate me. So I learned to be quiet, to smile and nod, and let other people make decisions about my life. But that wasn't really you. No, that was the version of me that made everyone else comfortable. The real me was always there underneath, getting more and more frustrated with being treated like a decoration instead of a person. Roan found himself thinking about his own years of feeling lost, first in the army, when politics trumped principle, then in civilian life, when his attempts to be the man he thought his family needed had failed so spectacularly. There was something achingly familiar in her description of learning to hide your true self in order to keep peace with people whose approval you needed to survive. When did you realize you couldn't keep living that way? The night before the wedding, when Edgar came to my room to discuss our arrangement. Her voice grew quiet, and Roan saw her hands tighten involuntarily. He explained how things would work once we were married, how I would manage his household, bear his children, represent his interests in social situations. He laid it all out like a business contract, complete with expectations and consequences. What kind of consequences? The kind that made it clear I would never be a wife to him. I'd be an employee whose job was to smile prettily and produce heirs on schedule. She met his eyes, and he saw the echo of anger and hurt that had driven her into the wilderness. That's when I realized that if I married him, I wouldn't just be lost, I'd disappear entirely. So you climbed out your bedroom window and ran into the night, wearing a dress that cost more than most people earn in a month, carrying nothing but the jewelry I could fit in my pockets and a determination to find out who I might be if I wasn't being what everyone else expected. And what have you discovered? That I'm stronger than I thought, that I can learn skills I never imagined needing, that I can make a fire and cook a meal and mend clothes and hold a knife like I mean to use it. She smiled, and he saw pride in her expression, the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd discovered their own competence. That I can spend weeks in a cabin with a taciturn mountain man and not only survive the experience, but actually enjoy his company. Even when the mountain man is moody and set in his ways and probably talks less in a week than most people do in an hour. Especially then. Do you want to know what I've learned about you, Roan Maddox? I'm not sure I do, but tell me anyway. I've learned that silence isn't always the absence of communication. Sometimes it's the presence of deep listening. That a man who chooses his words carefully usually has something worthwhile to say when he does speak. That someone who's learned to live alone isn't necessarily antisocial, he's just selective about who's worth breaking solitude for. The compliment caught him off guard, partly because it was unexpected, and partly because it revealed how closely she'd been watching him, how carefully she'd been trying to understand the man behind the careful barriers he maintained. And I've learned, she continued, that attraction isn't just about physical desire. It's about recognizing something in another person that calls to something in yourself, some quality you admire or need or want to be closer to. What do you see in me that calls to you? Strength without cruelty, protection without possessiveness, the ability to care for someone without trying to control them. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. And maybe most importantly, the courage to start over when life knocks you down, even if starting over means building something completely different from what you had before. Is that what we're doing, starting over? I think so. Both of us, in different ways. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, her hand still covering his, both of them aware that they were navigating new territory without map or compass. The broken instrument on the table between them seemed to mock the certainty they were both craving, the ability to know which direction led to happiness and which led to heartbreak. I'm scared, Isobel said finally. Of what? Of wanting this too much, of building my hopes around something that might not survive the spring thaw. And I'm scared of not wanting it enough, of holding back so much that I miss the chance for something real because I'm too afraid of losing it. So where does that leave us? Roan turned his hand palm up, interlacing their fingers. It leaves us here, in this moment, being honest about what we're feeling and what we're afraid of. Maybe that's all we can do, take it one day at a time, and trust that if we're both paying attention, we'll figure out which direction to go. Without a compass. The best navigators I ever knew said instruments could fail, but if you understood the fundamental show to read the sky, the lay of the land, the way water moves, you could find your way even when the tools let you down. And what are the fundamentals when it comes to this? She gestured between them, encompassing the fragile, growing thing that neither of them quite knew how to name. Honesty, I think, respect, the willingness to choose each other every day instead of just assuming the choice gets made once and then holds forever. That sounds simple. Simple, maybe. Not easy. As evening settled around their small cabin, they found themselves drawn back to the fire as they had been during the storm. But now the closeness felt chosen rather than necessary. When Isobel settled against his side, it wasn't just for warmth but for the simple comfort of contact with someone who was beginning to matter more than she'd expected. Roan? Thank you for letting me figure out who I am, instead of telling me who I should be. Thank you for showing me that starting over doesn't always mean starting alone. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and reminding them both that winter still held them in its grip. But inside their small circle of warmth and growing understanding, the broken compass seemed less important than the fact that they were learning to navigate by the stars they were creating together, fragile and new, but bright enough to find their way by, if they had the courage to keep looking up. The trapper appeared at Roan's door 3 days into February, emerging from the swirling snow like a ghost made solid. He was a grizzled man named Pete Hawkins, whom Roan had encountered perhaps half a dozen times over the year zone of the few people who worked the remote country with anything approaching Roan's own skill and discretion. His unexpected arrival sent alarm bells ringing in Roan's mind. Because Pete was not a social caller. Roan. Pete stamped his feet on the porch, shaking snow from his heavy coat. Got something for you. Came up from Billings 3 days ago. Roan stepped aside to let the older man enter, acutely aware of Isobel at the table behind him, her posture suddenly tense with the appearance of a stranger. Pete's eyes took in the domestic scene, the 2 coffee cups, the woman's clothing hung to dry near the fire, the unmistakable signs of shared occupancy, but his weathered face revealed nothing. Pete Hawkins, Roan said to Isobel, runs lines up north of here. Pete, this is Miss Reyes. Pete touched his hat politely, but didn't comment on her presence. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a folded telegram, the yellow paper crisp with cold. Fellow at the telegraph office in Billings paid me $20 to track you down and deliver this personal-like. Said it was urgent. Roan took the telegram with a growing sense of dread, recognizing immediately that anything urgent enough to warrant such expense and effort couldn't be good news. The paper crackled as he unfolded it, and he felt Isobel move to stand beside him, reading over his shoulder. The message was brief and to the point. Missing woman, Isobel Reyes, stop last seen. Billings December 15, stop $500 reward. For information leading to safe return. Stop believed, kidnapped by person or persons unknown. Stop contact Edgar Whitmore immediately with any information. Stop. Woman considered mentally unstable and dangerous to herself. Stop. Son of a bitch, Roan said quietly, the profanity carrying more weight for its rarity. There's more, Pete said, his voice carefully neutral. Word around town is that this Whitmore fellow has been spreading stories about the woman. Claims she stole a considerable sum of money from him before she disappeared. Says she's not quite right in the head, prone to fits and delusions. Isobel had gone very still beside him, and when Roan looked at her, he saw that all the color had drained from her face. Her hands were shaking as she reached for the telegram, reading it again, as if hoping the words might have changed. He's lying, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I never stole anything from him, and I'm not mentally unstable. I know that, Roan said firmly. Pete knows that too, don't you, Pete? The older trapper studied Isobel with the same careful attention he might give to reading track in difficult snow. Woman looks sane enough to me. Been taking care of herself up here without causing any trouble, near as I can tell. How many people have seen this telegram? Roan asked. Hard to say. Whitmore's been generous with rewards and loud with accusations. Half the trappers and hunters in 3 counties are probably keeping their eyes open for a dark-haired woman traveling alone. But I'm not traveling alone, Isobel said, and Roan heard the desperation creeping into her voice. I'm here with you. That has to count for something. Pete's expression was kind but realistic. Miss, with respect, that might make things worse. Man claims you've been kidnapped, and here you are staying in a remote cabin with a fellow who's not your husband. Doesn't matter what the truth is if the story's already taken hold in people's minds. The implications of Pete's words settled over the cabin like smoke from a green fire acrid, choking, impossible to ignore. Roan found himself thinking through the scenarios, his military training automatically assessing threats and calculating responses. None of the options looked good. How much time do we have? He asked. Hard to say. Snow's been keeping most folks close to home, but when it clears, there'll be people out looking. Whitmore's offering serious money, and money talks louder than conscience when times are hard. Roan nodded, his mind already shifting into the tactical thinking that had kept him alive through 2 wars and 10 years of wilderness living. What would you do, Pete, if you were me? The older man was quiet for a long moment, considering. If I were you, I'd get her somewhere safe and legal, like before the weather breaks. Maybe take her to the county seat. Let her tell her story to a judge who can sort fact from fiction. And if Edgar's money has already bought the judge's opinion, then you'd be in a world of trouble, and so would she. Isobel had been listening to this exchange with growing horror, and now she spoke up, her voice stronger than it had been moments before. I won't let Edgar destroy your life too. I'll leave tonight. Take my chances on my own rather than drag you into this mess. Like hell you will. The vehemence in Roan's voice surprised all 3 of them. You're not going anywhere alone, and you're sure as hell not giving up without a fight. But Pete's right. If people find me here with you, Edgar can claim I've been kidnapped. He can make you look like a criminal for helping me. Let me worry about what Edgar can make me look like. Pete cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to him. There might be another option. Not a good one, but better than waiting around for trouble to find you. I'm listening, Roan said. Take her to town yourself. Get ahead of the story instead of letting it chase you. Present her voluntary-like to the sheriff. Let her tell her side before Whitmore's version is the only one people have heard. That's assuming the sheriff will listen to her side. It's assuming you trust her to tell it convincingly, which, judging by the way you're looking at her, you do. The truth of Pete's observation hung in the air between them. Roan did trust Isobel not just to tell the truth, but to stand up for herself when it mattered most. The woman who'd thrown her engagement ring into the fire, rather than accept a life she didn't want, was capable of fighting for her freedom in a courtroom as well as a cabin. What do you think? He asked her. I think I'm tired of running. Tired of letting Edgar control my life, even when I'm hundreds of miles away from him. She straightened her shoulders, and Roan saw the steel in her spine that had brought her through the wilderness alive. If we're going to do this, we should do it right. Together. Together, he agreed, and felt something settle into place in his chest, a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since his army days, when protecting his soldiers had given meaning to every decision he made. Pete gathered his things to leave, declining Roan's offer of a meal with the practical understanding that his presence would only complicate an already difficult situation. At the door, he paused and looked back at them. For what it's worth, I think you're both doing the right thing. Sometimes the only way through a problem is straight ahead, no matter how scary the path looks. After Pete disappeared back into the swirling snow, leaving them alone with the terrible knowledge the telegram had brought, Roan and Isobel sat by the fire and tried to make sense of their new reality. He's clever, Isobel said finally, making me look like a victim and a criminal at the same time. If I'm mentally unstable, nothing I say can be trusted. If I'm a thief, I'm dangerous. Either way, anyone who helps me becomes suspect. Edgar underestimated one thing, though. What's that? He assumes people will believe his story just because he's rich and influential. But truth has a way of coming out when people are paying attention. And if it doesn't, if his money and connections are enough to convince a judge that I belong in an asylum or a jail cell? Roan was quiet for a long moment, considering possibilities he didn't want to examine too closely. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat certainty of a man who'd made difficult decisions before. Then we disappear. Canada's not that far, and I know country up there where even the Mounties don't go. We could build a life where Edgar Whitmore's money doesn't reach. You do that? Give up everything you've built here? This cabin is just wood and stone. What I've built that matters is sitting right here next to me. The admission cost him something to make, but it was true in ways that surprised him. Somewhere during the long winter months, Isobel had become more important to him than the careful solitude he'd constructed, more valuable than the safety of isolation. The thought of losing her to Edgar's lies and manipulations was unbearable in a way that losing his mountain sanctuary was not. "We won't have to run," she said, her voice quiet but determined. "Because I'm going to fight him. In court, in public, wherever it takes. Edgar Whitmore has had his way with my life for the last time." As they sat together in the firelight, planning their descent from the mountain and their confrontation with the civilized world below, Roan found himself thinking about the telegram that had changed everything. It was just a piece of paper, no different from dozens of others he'd seen over the years. But like Pete's broken compass, it represented the fragility of the life they'd been building together, how quickly external forces could threaten the small sanctuary they'd created. But it also represented something else, the moment when running and hiding stopped being options, when the only way forward was to stand and fight for what mattered most. And for the first time in 10 years, Roan Maddox had something worth fighting for that couldn't be replaced or rebuilt, someone whose safety and happiness mattered more than his own peace of mind. The storm outside continued its assault on their small cabin, but inside, they were no longer just waiting for spring. They were preparing for war. The decision to leave the mountain came with the weight of abandoning sanctuary for the uncertainty of battle. Over the next week, as they prepared for their descent to Kalispell, Roan found himself moving through their small cabin with the deliberate precision of a soldier preparing for deployment. Every choice, what to pack, what to leave behind, how to present their case carried consequences that could determine whether they returned to this place as free people or never returned at all. From a trunk beneath his bed, Roan retrieved items he hadn't touched in 10 years. His service revolver, oiled and wrapped in cloth, still fit his hand with the familiar weight of authority and purpose. The gun belt that had once been part of his daily uniform felt strange around his waist after a decade of civilian life. But his muscle memory adapted quickly to its presence. "You think it will come to that?" Isobel asked, watching him check the weapon's action with practiced efficiency. "I think Edgar Whitmore is a man who's used to getting what he wants through money and intimidation. When those don't work, men like him tend to escalate." "And you're prepared to escalate with him?" Roan met her eyes, and she saw in them the soldier. He'd been someone who understood that violence was sometimes the only language bullies understood. "I'm prepared to protect what matters to me. However, that needs to happen." But the gun wasn't their only preparation. More important was the careful documentation they assembled to counter Edgar's lies. Isobel wrote out her account of the engagement and her reasons for leaving, her handwriting steady and clear as she detailed Edgar's controlling behavior and the circumstances that had driven her to flee. They gathered the remains of her original dress, the fabric and design clearly expensive and inconsistent with the behavior of a mentally unstable vagrant. Most crucial was a letter Roan penned to his former commanding officer, Colonel James Morrison, who'd gone on to a successful career in military law after the war. It was a difficult letter to write, requiring him to explain his decade of exile and ask for help from a world he'd deliberately left behind. But Morrison had been one of the few officers who'd supported Roan's protests about corruption in the defense contracts. And if anyone would understand the importance of fighting institutional bullying, it would be him. I haven't written to anyone from my old life in 10 years, Roan said as he sealed the letter. Part of me wonders if Morrison will even remember who I was. He'll remember. Men like you don't fade from memory just because you disappear into the mountains. Men like me? Men who stand up for what's right even when it costs them something. That's not common enough to forget. As they made their final preparations, their conversations took on a different quality, more intimate, more honest, as if the impending confrontation had stripped away the last barriers between them. They spoke about fears they'd never voiced, dreams they'd been afraid to acknowledge, the future they both wanted but were terrified they might not survive to see. I keep thinking about the wooden horse, Isobel said one evening as they sat by the fire, her head resting against his shoulder. About your son Daniel and what you'd want him to know about the man you've become. What made you think of that? Because I realized I want him to be proud of his father, not just for the man who carved him toys and told him stories, but for the man who came out of exile to fight for someone else's freedom. The observation hit him harder than he'd expected. For 10 years, he told himself that his withdrawal from the world was about self-preservation, about avoiding the pain of caring too much about outcomes he couldn't control. But now he wondered if some part of it had been about shame, about feeling like he'd failed at being the kind of man his son could look up to. I've made a lot of mistakes, he said quietly. Lost things that mattered because I was too proud or too angry or too scared to fight for them the right way. But you're fighting now, for me, for us, for the chance to build something honest and real. And if we lose, if Edgar's money and influence are enough to convince people that his version of the truth is the only one that matters, then we'll know we tried, that we didn't let him win without a fight. That might not be enough comfort if you end up in an asylum and I end up in prison. She lifted her head to look at him, her dark eyes serious but unafraid. Roan, I've spent most of my life living according to other people's plans for me. Being safe, being protected, being told what to think and feel and want, and I was dying inside, a little more each day. And now I'm living, really living maybe for the first time. Making my own choices, taking my own risks, caring about someone because I choose to, not because it's expected of me. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his bearded cheek. Even if we lose everything, I'll have had these months of being truly alive. That's worth fighting for. You're braver than I am. No, I'm not. But I'm learning that bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and choosing to do the right thing anyway. On their last night in the cabin, they made love with a desperate tenderness that spoke of all the things they couldn't bring themselves to say aloud. Afterward, as they lay entwined before the dying fire, Roan found himself memorizing details, the way the firelight painted gold highlights in her hair, the sound of her breathing as she drifted towards sleep, the weight of her hand resting over his heart. Whatever happens, he whispered into the darkness, these months with you have been the most real thing in my life in 10 years. For me too, she murmured against his chest. Thank you for showing me what it means to be chosen instead of claimed. Morning came too soon, bringing with it the clear skies and bitter cold that would make their journey possible but miserable. They loaded the sled with their essential supplies and the evidence they'd assembled, leaving behind the small domestic details that had made the cabin feel like home, the wooden horse still sitting on the table, the mended clothes hanging from pegs, the extra firewood stacked near the hearth for their return. If they returned, the descent from the mountain took 2 days of careful travel through snow that ranged from knee-deep to waist-high in the deeper drifts. Roan had fashioned snowshoes for both of them, and they took turns breaking trail and pulling the sled through terrain that would have been challenging for experienced mountaineers. But they made steady progress, camping one night in a shelter Roan had built years earlier for just such emergencies. As they drew closer to civilization, they began to encounter signs of the larger world smoke from distant chimneys, the cut-over stumps of logged areas, eventually the grooved ruts of a wagon road that would lead them to Kalispell and whatever awaited them there. Ready? Roan asked, as they paused at the edge of town, looking down at the collection of buildings that represented law, order, and Edgar Whitmore's influence. No, Isobel said honestly. "But I'm going anyway." The sheriff's office sat on Main Street, between a general store and a saloon, a substantial brick building that projected authority and permanence. As they approached its door, Roan felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always preceded combat hyper-awareness of surroundings, the calculating assessment of threats and advantages, the mental preparation for violence that might be necessary but wasn't yet inevitable. "Remember," he said quietly, "we tell the truth, the whole truth, and we don't let them separate us unless they arrest one of us. And if they do arrest one of us, then the other fights twice as hard." Sheriff Ben Morisono, relation to Roan's former colonel, despite the name, was a thick-set man in his 50s with the careful eyes of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of easy answers. He looked up from his paperwork as they entered, his gaze taking in their mountain clothes, their obvious travel weariness, and the way they stood close together like people who'd learned to depend on each other. "Help you, folks. I'm Roan Maddox, and this is Miss Isobel Reyes. I believe you've been looking for her." The sheriff's expression sharpened immediately, his hand moving closer to the gun on his hip with practiced caution. "Well, I'll be damned." "Yes, sir. We surely have been looking for Miss Reyes. Question is, are you the fellow who's been holding her against her will?" "No, sir. I'm the fellow who's been keeping her alive while she decided what she wanted to do with her freedom." "That's an interesting way to put it." Morrison's voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away about his own opinions. "Miss Reyes, are you here of your own free will?" "Yes, Sheriff. Completely." "And you're prepared to answer some questions about your disappearance and the circumstances surrounding it?" "Yes, sir, that's why we're here." Morrison studied them both for a long moment, then gestured toward chairs in front of his desk. "Then let's start at the beginning. And I mean the very beginning. What made you climb out your bedroom window on the night before your wedding and disappear into the Montana wilderness wearing nothing but a party dress?" As Isobel began to tell her story, Roan found himself watching the sheriff's face for signs of prejudgment or corruption. What he saw instead was careful attention and growing skepticism not about Isobel's story, but about the version of events Edgar had been promoting. This was going to be a fair fight after all. And for the first time since Pete had delivered that telegram, Roan Maddox allowed himself to believe they might actually win it. Sheriff Morrison listened to Isobel's account with the careful attention of a man who'd heard enough lies to recognize truth when it sat in front of him. She spoke clearly and without dramatics, detailing Edgar's controlling behavior, his treatment of their engagement as a business arrangement, and the specific threats he'd made about how their marriage would be conducted. When she finished, Morrison leaned back in his chair and studied them both with intelligent eyes. "That's quite a story, Miss Reyes. Paints Mr. Whitmore in a considerably different light than his telegrams and letters would suggest." "It's the truth, Sheriff. Every word of it. I'm inclined to believe you. Problem is, Mr. Whitmore has been very persuasive in his correspondence. Claims you took a considerable sum of money when you left, and that you've been suffering from feminine hysteria that makes you prone to delusions and dangerous behavior." Roan felt his jaw tighten at the casual way Morrison repeated Edgar's accusations, but he forced himself to remain silent. This was Isobel's fight to start, and she needed to establish her credibility in her own words. "Sheriff," Isobel said, her voice steady, despite the color that had risen in her cheeks, "I took nothing from Edgar Whitmore that belonged to him. And as for feminine hysteria, I'd suggest that any woman who spent 10 minutes in his company would develop a strong desire to escape. Can you prove you didn't take any money?" "Can he prove I did? I left with the clothes on my back and my mother's jewelry. Nothing else." Morrison nodded thoughtfully, then turned his attention to Roan. "And you, Mr. Maddox, what's your part in all this?" "I found her half-frozen near my trapline and brought her home to recover. When the weather cleared enough for travel, I brought her here to set the record straight." "Just like that? Out of the goodness of your heart?" "Something like that. Mr. Whitmore suggests you might have had other motives. Says men who live alone in the mountains sometimes develop unhealthy fixations on vulnerable women. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a badly banked fire. Roan felt his hand move instinctively toward his gun, then forced himself to stillness. Violence wouldn't help Isobel's case, no matter how satisfying it might be. "Sheriff," Isobel interjected before Roan could respond, "Mr. Maddox has treated me with nothing but respect and kindness. He saved my life, protected me through the worst winter in memory, and asked nothing in return except that I not do anything foolish enough to get us both killed." "That's a glowing testimonial, miss. But then, Stockholm Syndrome can make captives defend their captors." This time it was Isobel who showed anger, her dark eyes flashing with indignation. "I am not suffering from Stockholm Syndrome, Sheriff Morrison. I am a grown woman who made a conscious choice to escape an intolerable situation, and another conscious choice to accept help from a decent man when I needed it." "Easy, miss. I'm not saying I believe Mr. Whitmore's version. I'm just telling you what he's been saying, and what some folks around here are inclined to believe. What would it take to convince you and those folks that Mr. Whitmore is lying?" Morrison was quiet for a moment, considering. "Well, for starters, it would help if we could verify your story about why you left. Maybe talk to some people who knew you both before this all started. Most of the people who knew us both were Edgar's business associates or social connections. They're not likely to contradict him." "Maybe not, but there might be other servants, neighbors, people who saw how he treated you when he thought no one important was watching. There was Maria Santos, the woman who worked in my father's house. She saw how Edgar spoke to me, how he acted when he thought he had the right to make decisions about my life." "Where would we find Mrs. Santos?" "I don't know. After Papa died, Edgar dismissed most of the staff. Said a bachelor didn't need a full household." Morrison made a note, then looked up at them again. "What about proof that you didn't steal any money? Bank records, maybe?" "Edgar controlled all the financial arrangements. I wasn't allowed access to any accounts after Papa died. Convenient for him. Makes it hard to prove you didn't take something if there's no record of what you had access to in the first place." The sheriff's badge caught the light as he leaned forward, and Roan found himself studying the man's face for signs of where his sympathies lay. What he saw was professional skepticism, tempered by growing concern, the expression of someone who was beginning to suspect he'd been fed a carefully constructed story designed to cover up something ugly. "There's something else you should know," Morrison said. "Mr. Whitmore arrived in town yesterday. Says he's here to personally oversee Miss Reyes' return to proper medical care." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Isobel went very still beside Roan, and he felt his own muscles tense with the proximity of danger. Edgar wasn't just manipulating from a distance anymore. He was here, in person, ready to press his case with whatever leverage his money and connections could provide. "Where is he staying?" Roan asked, his voice carefully controlled. "The Grand Hotel. Has himself a suite and 2 men who look like they've seen the rough side of life. Says they're there to help transport Miss Reyes safely back to medical care, but they look more like enforcers to me." "Hired muscle," Isobel said quietly. "Edgar always preferred to have other people handle the unpleasant details." "Well, he's requested a meeting first thing tomorrow morning. Says he wants to see for himself that you're unharmed, and to discuss the terms of your return to his care." "Terms?" Roan's voice had gone flat and dangerous. "She's not livestock to be negotiated over." "Easy, Mr. Maddox. I'm just telling you what the man said." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I'd need to speak with Miss Reyes first, get her side of the story before I made any decisions about her future." "And now that you have—" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying them both with the careful attention of a man who understood that his next words would determine whether justice or politics would prevail in his jurisdiction. "Now I'm thinking Mr. Whitmore's story has some holes in it that need explaining, and I'm thinking Miss Reyes has a right to speak for herself about what she wants to do with her life." Relief flooded through Roan at the sheriff's words, but he knew they weren't safe yet. Edgar's presence in town meant the real battle was just beginning, and men with money and connections didn't give up easily when their carefully laid plans were threatened. "What happens tomorrow?" Isobel asked. Tomorrow we all sit down together and let Mr. Whitmore make his case. Then you make yours. Then I decide who's telling the truth and who's trying to use my badge to settle a personal score. And if Edgar tries to take me by force, then he'll discover that kidnapping is still illegal in this county, regardless of how much money a man has or how many hired guns he brings with him. The sheriff's badge wasn't just catching the light, no, it was reflecting it, becoming a symbol of the law's protection for those brave enough to claim it. But Roan knew that badges were only as strong as the men who wore them, and tomorrow would test whether Sheriff Morrison's principles were stronger than Edgar's influence. As they left the sheriff's office to find lodging for the night, Roan felt the weight of his service revolver against his hip and allowed himself a grim smile. Edgar Whitmore had brought hired muscle to intimidate them into submission. He had no idea that he was trying to intimidate a man who'd learned to fight dirty in 2 wars and survived 10 years in country that killed the unprepared. Tomorrow would be very educational for Mr. Edgar Whitmore. Very educational indeed. Edgar Whitmore arrived at the sheriff's office precisely at 9 o'clock, flanked by 2 men whose presence left no doubt about their profession. He was younger than Roan had expected, perhaps 35, with the soft look of someone who'd never done a day's physical labor, but the hard eyes of someone who'd learned to get his way through intimidation and wealth. "Sheriff Morrison," Edgar said as he entered, not bothering to acknowledge Roan or Isobel. "I trust you've had adequate time to assess the situation and prepare Miss Reyes for her return to proper care. Mr. Whitmore, please, have a seat." Morrison's voice was professionally courteous, but offered no warmth. "Before we discuss Miss Reyes' future, I think it would be helpful if she had a chance to respond to some of the allegations you've made." Edgar's gaze finally settled on Isobel, and Roan saw her stiffen beside him at the cold possessiveness in the other man's eyes. It was the look of someone examining property that had been damaged in his absence. "Isobel," Edgar said, his voice carrying false warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "My dear, you look terrible. This ordeal has clearly taken a tremendous toll on your health and mental state." "I'm perfectly healthy, Edgar, and my mental state has never been clearer." "Now, darling, we both know that's not true. The stress of your father's death, the responsibility of managing his estate, the pressure of our upcoming marriage, it all became too much for your delicate constitution." Roan watched Isobel's face as Edgar spoke, saw the way she struggled to contain her anger at his patronizing tone. This was the voice that had shaped her entire adult life, gentle on the surface but implacable underneath, designed to make resistance seem childish and unreasonable. "My constitution is stronger than you think," she said quietly, "strong enough to survive a Montana winter, apparently. Under the influence of this mountain man who clearly took advantage of your vulnerable state." Edgar's gaze shifted to Roan with undisguised contempt. "I can hardly blame you for being confused, dear. Isolation and trauma can make a woman susceptible to all sorts of unhealthy attachments." "Mr. Whitmore," Sheriff Morrison interjected, "Miss Reyes has made some serious allegations about your behavior toward her. Perhaps you'd like to address those before we discuss her mental state." "Allegations? What sort of allegations?" Morrison consulted his notes. "She claims you threatened her with physical consequences if she didn't comply with your expectations about how your marriage would be conducted. That you treated the engagement as a business arrangement rather than a romantic partnership. That you dismissed her household staff without consulting her and took control of her father's business interests without her consent." Edgar's laugh was smooth and practiced. "Sheriff, you're a man of the world. Surely you understand that a woman in Isobel's state might misinterpret normal masculine authority as threatening behavior. She's been through a tremendous trauma, losing her father so suddenly and being thrust into responsibilities she wasn't prepared for." "I wasn't traumatized by Papa's death," Isobel said, her voice growing stronger. "I was traumatized by your behavior afterward. By the way you moved into our house and started making decisions about my life as if I were a piece of furniture to be rearranged. Darling, please, this is exactly the kind of emotional instability I've been concerned about. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years." For the first time since entering the room, Edgar seemed to register that this wasn't going to be the simple retrieval of property he'd expected. His mask of gentle concern slipped slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "Sheriff Morrison, I hope you understand that I have Miss Reyes' best interests at heart. She's clearly been through an ordeal that has left her confused and vulnerable. This man," he gestured toward Roan, "has obviously filled her head with ideas that are contrary to her natural inclinations and best interests. And what would you know about her natural inclinations?" The words came out of Roan's mouth before he could stop them, his voice carrying the flat menace of controlled violence. Edgar's two hired men shifted slightly at Roan's tone, hands moving closer to concealed weapons. But Edgar himself seemed unimpressed by the implied threat. "I know Isobel better than anyone, having been responsible for her welfare since her father's death. I know she's gentle, submissive, and in need of strong, masculine guidance to help her navigate life's complexities. You don't know me at all." Isobel's voice cut through Edgar's condescension like a blade through silk. "You know the woman I pretended to be because I was afraid of what would happen if I showed you who I really was." "And who are you really, Miss Reyes?" Sheriff Morrison asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Isobel stood, her posture straight and proud, despite the simple mountain clothes she wore. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd discovered her own strength. "I'm a woman who can survive in the wilderness, who can learn new skills when my life depends on it, who can make her own decisions about who to trust and who to love. I'm someone who refuses to be treated like property or livestock, who won't accept a marriage based on obligation rather than choice." "Isobel, please," Edgar said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "This romantic nonsense is exactly what I'm talking about. You're not equipped for independence. You need structure, guidance, protection. I need respect. I need to be seen as a person rather than a problem to be managed. And I need the freedom to choose my own future. Your future is with me. We have legal agreements, financial arrangements. We have nothing. I never agreed to marry you, Edgar. My father may have thought it was a good idea, but he's dead, and I'm not bound by arrangements I never consented to." The room fell silent, except for the steady tick of the clock on Morrison's wall. Edgar's face had gone pale with rage, and Roan could see him struggling to maintain his facade of reasonable concern. "Sheriff," Edgar said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "I'm prepared to offer substantial compensation to your department for the safe return of Miss Reyes to proper medical care. I'm also prepared to overlook any charges of kidnapping against Mr. Maddox, assuming Miss Reyes receives the treatment she needs." Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Edgar with new interest. "That sounds an awful lot like bribery, Mr. Whitmore. I prefer to think of it as civic appreciation for professional services rendered. And what if I decide Miss Reyes doesn't need medical care? What if I conclude she's perfectly capable of making her own decisions about her future?" Edgar's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the ugly reality beneath. "Then you'd be making a very serious mistake, Sheriff. I have significant business interests in this territory, and I employ a great many people who depend on my continued goodwill. It would be unfortunate if my confidence in local law enforcement were to be shaken." The threat hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Roan felt his hand move instinctively toward his weapon, but Morrison raised a hand to stop him. "Mr. Whitmore," the sheriff said, his voice deadly calm, "are you threatening me? I'm simply pointing out the reality of how business is conducted in this territory. Men with influence expect certain considerations in return for their contributions to local prosperity." "I see. And what happens if I decide those considerations don't extend to helping you kidnap a woman who doesn't want to go with you?" Edgar's hired men tensed at the sheriff's words, hands moving closer to their weapons. But Morrison wasn't intimidated by hired muscle, and his own hand rested casually on his gun butt. "Gentlemen," Morrison continued, "I think it's time for you to leave. All of you. Miss Reyes has made her position clear, and I'm satisfied that she's competent to make her own decisions about her future." "This isn't over," Edgar said, his voice vibrating with rage. "I have lawyers, Sheriff. I have connections. I have resources you can't imagine. And I have a badge and a very clear understanding of the law regarding kidnapping and extortion. Your move, Mr. Whitmore." As Edgar and his men filed out of the office, their faces dark with thwarted rage, Roan felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight since Pete delivered that telegram. The immediate battle was won, but he knew Edgar was right about one thing: this wasn't over. Men like him didn't accept defeat gracefully, and they had long memories for slights against their authority. But for now, Isobel was free. She'd found her voice and used it to claim her own life, and no amount of money or influence could take that away from her. As Morrison closed the door behind Edgar's retreating figure, he turned to them with a tired smile. "Well," he said, "that was educational. Think he'll try something stupid?" "Count on it," Roan replied. "But we'll be ready." Isobel's hand found his, squeezing gently. "We'll be ready." She agreed, and in her voice he heard the strength that had carried her through winter storms and Edgar's manipulations, the unbreakable will of a woman who'd finally learned to fight for herself. 3 months later, the wedding quilt lay spread across the cabin's simple wooden table, its intricate patterns catching the spring sunlight that streamed through windows, finally freed from their winter shutters. The women of Kalispell had spent weeks creating the masterpiece, traditional double wedding ring design, worked in blues and golds that would grace the bed Roan had built, with his own hands for the wife he'd never expected to find. "Mrs. Patterson says she's never seen finer stitching than yours, Isobel," Sarah Hendricks said as she adjusted one corner of the quilt. "Claims you've got the steadiest hand for detail work she's encountered in 30 years of quilting circles." Isobel smiled as she smoothed her hand over the fabric, marveling at how different her life had become since that desperate night when she'd climbed from her bedroom window in Billings. These hands that had once been soft and useless for anything more demanding than embroidery now bore the calluses of real work: cooking, cleaning, mending, and the 100 daily tasks that mountain life required. "She's been patient with my learning," Isobel replied. "I never had the chance to do practical needlework before. Papa always said such things were beneath a lady's station." "Well, your papa never had to make his own clothes or mend his own quilts," Mrs. Patterson said with the tartness that had made her the unofficial leader of Kalispell's charitable ladies. "Out here, a woman who can't take care of herself and her family with her own 2 hands isn't much use to anybody." It was blunt speaking, but Isobel had learned to appreciate the mountain women's directness. After years of navigating the subtle manipulations and unspoken expectations of society life, the honest clarity of frontier relationships had been like stepping from a stuffy parlor into clean mountain air. The legal battles with Edgar had finally ended just 2 weeks ago, his lawyers withdrawing their challenges to Isobel's freedom after a thorough investigation revealed discrepancies in his financial claims and testimony from Maria Santos that confirmed Isobel's account of his controlling behavior. Sheriff Morrison's careful documentation and Colonel Morrison's letter of support had indeed remembered Roan and was happy to vouch for his character, had provided the legal foundation they needed to establish Isobel's competency and right to self-determination. Edgar himself had returned to Billings in defeat, his reputation damaged by the public examination of his treatment of his former fiancée. Word had reached them through traveling merchants that he'd sold most of his Montana interests and moved to California, apparently deciding that a territory where women could successfully challenge male authority wasn't suitable for his business model. "I still can't believe you're really staying," admitted Jenny Cooper, the youngest of the quilting circle at barely 20. "When I heard about a woman who'd survived a whole winter alone with a mountain man, I thought for sure she'd hightail it back to civilization first chance she got." "This is civilization," Isobel said, gesturing toward the cabin's windows where the view encompassed miles of pristine wilderness. "Maybe not the kind with opera houses and fancy restaurants, but the kind where people help each other survive and thrive without asking what they can get in return. And the kind where a woman can speak her mind without being told she's hysterical," added Mrs. Patterson, with a meaningful look at the younger women. That's worth more than all the fancy parlors in the world. Through the window, Isobel could see Roan working with Tom Hendricks and Pete Hawkins to expand the cabin's single room into a proper house suitable for the family they were planning. The sound of hammers and saws mixed with the men's occasional laughter, and she felt a deep contentment settle over her like a familiar blanket. The man she was marrying tomorrow was not the broken hermit who'd found her half frozen in the snow 5 months ago. That man had been hiding from life, protecting himself from further loss by refusing to care about anything he might lose. The man building their future with his own hands was someone who'd rediscovered the courage to hope, to plan, to build something larger than mere survival. He seems different now, Jenny observed, following Isobel's gaze. Mr. Maddox, I mean. When I was little, I remember seeing him in town maybe once or twice a year, and he always looked so stern, forbidding, like he might bite if you got too close. Grief will do that to a man, Mrs. Mosen, Patterson said quietly. Make him build walls so high he can't see over them himself. Take someone special to help him remember there's a world worth living in beyond those walls. I didn't help him remember, Isobel said. We helped each other. That's what real partnerships do they make. Both people stronger than either could be alone. The afternoon passed in companionable work, the women adding final touches to the quilt while sharing stories and advice about marriage, children, and the particular challenges of frontier life. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they packed up their supplies and prepared to return to town for the evening. Tomorrow, at 2 o'clock, Mrs. Patterson reminded Isobel as she gathered her sewing basket. And don't you dare be late. I've seen too many mountain weddings where the bride got cold feet at the last minute. I won't be late, Isobel promised, and meant it. She'd waited 23 years to make a choice this important, entirely on her own terms. She wasn't about to waste a moment of it now. After the women left, Isobel walked outside to where Roan was securing the last of the day's work. The addition was taking shape nicely, a proper bedroom, a larger kitchen, and a sitting room that would give them space to grow into the life they were building together. How did the quilting go? He asked, wiping sawdust from his hands on a cloth rag. Beautifully. Mrs. Patterson says it's the finest wedding quilt she's seen in 20 years. High praise from her. Roan pulled her into his arms, not caring that his clothes were dusty from the day's work. You nervous about tomorrow? Should I be? Most brides are, from what I've heard. Isobel considered this, looking out over the clearing that had become home in ways she'd never expected. I think I used up all my nervousness climbing out that bedroom window in December. Everything since then has just been living. Just living, he repeated, and she heard satisfaction in his voice. I liked the sound of that. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching shadows lengthen across their small domain. In a few hours, this would be their last evening as unmarried people. Tomorrow would make official what had been growing between them since that first desperate night when he'd carried her home from the snow. I got a letter today, Roan said eventually, from Sarah. Isobel felt her breath catch. It was the first communication he'd received from his ex-wife since the divorce papers 10 years ago. What did she say? She heard about the wedding through some mutual friends. Wanted to congratulate us and to tell me that Daniel's doing well. He's 17 now, graduating from school in California next year. That must have been difficult to read. Yes and no. It hurt, knowing I've missed so much of his growing up. But it also felt like a door closing on the man I used to be. The one who was too angry and bitter to appreciate what he had while he had it. And now I'm grateful for second chances. For the opportunity to build a family based on choice rather than obligation, love rather than duty. The word family hung in the air between them, weighted with possibilities they'd only begun to explore. They'd talked about children during the long winter evenings, about the sons and daughters who might grow up in this wild, beautiful country where strength mattered more than social position. About that, Isobel said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I have something to tell you. Something in her tone made him look at her more closely, and she saw the moment when understanding dawned in his eyes. Are you? 3 months along, near as I can figure, due sometime in early fall. The joy that transformed his face was like watching sunrise break over the mountain peaks, gradual at first, then blazing with a light that illuminated everything around it. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her in a circle while she laughed at his exuberance. "A baby," he said when he finally set her down, his voice full of wonder. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Happy doesn't begin to cover it. Terrified, amazed, grateful, excited, all of those and more. Good, because this child is going to need a father who understands that love isn't about claiming or possessing. It's about nurturing and protecting while still allowing room to grow. "I've learned a few things about that recently," he said, his hand coming to rest gently over her still flat belly. "Had a good teacher. We taught each other." As they walked back toward the cabin, where tomorrow's wedding quilt awaited them, Isobel found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with desperation and flight, with a woman so lost she'd preferred death in the wilderness to life without choice. But it had become something else entirely, a love story built on mutual respect, shared struggle, and the courage to choose each other every day. "Roan, do you ever regret it, giving up your solitude for all this complication?" He was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously, as he always did when she asked something important. "I regret the years I wasted believing that isolation was safety," he said finally. "I regret the time I lost with Daniel because I was too proud to fight for what mattered most. But regret this, regret finding you, choosing you, building a life with you? And never, not for a single moment." Inside the cabin, they prepared their simple evening meal, together with the practiced coordination of people who'd learned to work as partners. The wooden horse Daniel had never outgrown still sat on the table, but now it was joined by other things: Isobel's sewing basket, seed packets for their spring garden, sketches for the baby's cradle Roan had already begun planning. As they settled by the fire after supper, Isobel found herself thinking about the woman she'd been just 5 months ago. Afraid, controlled, living her life according to other people's expectations. That woman had been dying slowly, suffocating on courtesy and compliance. The woman she'd become was fully alive, making her own choices and accepting responsibility for the consequences. "What are you thinking about?" Roan asked, noticing her contemplative mood. "The wedding quilt. How it's made up of all these separate pieces, each one beautiful on its own, but becoming something even more beautiful when they're joined together. Good metaphor for marriage." "I hope so. I hope we can stay separate enough to be interesting and joined enough to be strong. I think we can manage that." Outside, the spring wind sang through the pine boughs with a sound like distant music. Tomorrow there would be a wedding, with the entire population of Kalispell invited to witness their commitment to each other. There would be dancing and feasting and all the joyful celebration that frontier communities brought to moments of happiness. But tonight, there was just the two of them, and the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent, a future well planned, and a love well chosen. As they banked the fire and prepared for bed, Isobel felt a deep contentment settle over her, the peace that came from finally, completely, belonging exactly where she was. In the morning, she would wake as Isobel Reyes for the last time. By evening, she would be Isobel Maddox, wife to a man who'd learned to love without claiming, mother to a child who would grow up understanding that strength came from choice rather than submission. It was a good name for a new life, the best possible foundation for all the tomorrows stretching ahead of them, bright as mountain sunrise and full of promise.